Love and life interested me so that I dared to knock at the door of the cosmos.
Welcome to the Sun Ra Archive podcast. Since 2002, Sun Ra Archive has been an extension of my personal study and sharing those discoveries with others. Our goal is dedicated to preserving the legacy of jazz musician, composer, keyboard pioneer, visionary philosopher, and band leader Sun Ra and his group of master musicians, the Sun Ra Orchestra. You can follow us online at facebook.com/Sun Ra Archive and explore our library of articles at sunraarchive.blogspot.com.
Hello.
Hi, Robert. It's Christopher. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
I'd like to welcome Robert Campbell to the Sun Ra Archive podcast. Welcome, Robert, and thank you for making the time for me.
Thank you.
Robert is a retired professor emeritus of psychology at Clemson University. He specialized in developmental and cognitive psychology and taught there for 28 years. He has a very, very impressive CV in psychology, and Sun Ra fans will know Robert from his exhaustive and exalted work in documenting the discography of Sun Ra's earthly recordings. In addition to that, Robert was a jazz critic for Cadence Magazine. He's written liner notes and provided research for at least 20 or more Sun Ra releases. Recently, he's been a contributor to Omniverse Sun Ra that was published by Art Yard Records. His first edition of the Earthly Recordings of Sun Ra was published in 1994 by Cadence Books, and it was followed up in 2000 with the second edition that was co-authored with Chris Trent. The book is still in print and can be ordered from Cadence Jazz Books. In addition to Earthly Recordings of Sun Ra in print, Robert has taken that research into greater depths of looking into all of the musicians and labels and venues in the greater Chicago area that were contemporary to Sun Ra's years in Chicago. Most notably, Robert's webpage, Sonny Blount to Sun Ra, The Chicago Years, which was also contributed to by Christopher Trent and Robert Pruder.
I put a lot of effort into it over time, and after a while, my co-author Chris Trent put a lot of work into it as well. If we ever do a third edition, people do ask, and as soon as you publish a discography, you discover all the stuff that needs adding and changing, of course. So that started happening very shortly after the second edition was published. I mean, if there's a third edition, there will probably be additional collaborators, realistically. The thing kept growing and growing. So I don't play copies of cassette tapes recorded on Walkman at Sun Ra concerts terribly often anymore. Still have a library of things like that, but if it's needed for edition number 3, I may be doing some more of that.
I know myself and all of the other Sun Ra fans that enjoy and rely on your work, that's the most common question is, will there be a third edition? And perhaps we can come back and touch on that at the end of our conversation a little bit more. But before we jump to that point, can you tell me how you originally became a Sun Ra fan and what kind of a musical path led you to becoming a Sun Ra fan?
Well, it was a path with a lot of pauses and diversions and such. I'm not a trained musician. The reason I haven't given a lot of public lectures about Sun Ra is that I'm not a music professor. Okay. There are issues related to pitched material, as I think Alan Chase says, that you should not ask me because I don't have the training. I'm not a musician and so forth. But I have been interested in related kinds of music for quite a long time. My interest in jazz really got started in high school. Often when I look at something that I picked up back then, it's because a friend of mine who died, unfortunately and tragically, in a car accident when he was 20 told me about it. I had a classmate in high school who was very interested in a lot of different kinds of music that I still listen to. but it also meant that I had heard several records by Cecil Taylor before I ever heard one by Coleman Hawkins. This was the late 1960s.
Okay.
I can still remember the first time I heard Body and Soul by Coleman Hawkins. It was at a college radio station that I was volunteering at part-time, and I put the record on the turntable, and my first thought was, wow, that guy sounds really quaint. Of course, now it's something I practically take for granted. So my first encounter with Sun Ra came when I was in school. I was an undergraduate, majoring in psychology, and there was a store that actually had some records by Sun Ra. This was one of the periods, this was the period, in fact, when a distributor, not one with a terribly wide reach, but a distributor actually picked up and made available to record stores some L. Saturn recordings, from the Chicago L. Saturn operation, Alton Abraham directly. And I actually first heard My Brother the Wind and Magic City and things like that. And of course, it was also possible to get a couple of ESP albums by Sun Ra, and at first I didn't know what to do with them. There were Delmark reissues of some of his earlier music from Chicago. At first I really couldn't figure what those had to do with some of the other stuff I was listening to. Another experience I still recall from that period is I was back in the Houston, Texas area where I lived then for the summer, and there was a record store that I occasionally hung out at where one of the salesmen was actually a jazz singer part-time, and occasionally I would bring something in and play it for him. Even though he had much more conservative tastes in jazz than I did, we actually played the entire Magic City in stereo in the listening room. I have no idea what the other store patrons thought of that, but he was actually kind of intrigued by some of it. So, okay, I went to grad school in Austin, Texas. Different kinds of music could be heard there. It would be a few years before anybody was carrying Philadelphia Saturns. Eventually it got so that there was a small record store that had a few of those. But, I was busy with grad school stuff, trying to do my research and so on. And I went through probably a decade of, occasionally putting on the Sun Ra records that I owned and listening to them. And occasionally looking at Harvey Picard's article in Coda and wondering when the hell I or anybody else who was interested in that music would get to hear most of what he was talking about. He had access to all kinds of records that had never been included in that distribution deal briefly, around 1970. And that was kind of where things froze for a while. I got a job with IBM in 1985. And at one of its locations in Westchester County, they were hiring psychologists to do human-computer interaction, which I was, doing for them at the time. That meant I could go into the city and actually hear live jazz on a regular basis. In Houston, you could occasionally find some, but not frequently. And more importantly, in 1987, WKCR-FM decided to have a Sun Ra festival. And hearing the back and forth between Sonny and Phil Schaap, where Schaap was determined to find out what happened on a particular date, which was usually not Sonny's orientation toward things, and he was at least occasionally successful, was pretty amazing. But more importantly, the Institute of Jazz Studies made a lot of records available for that broadcast. And several friends of mine and I, who were all into jazz at my IBM location, actually took turns calling the station when Phil Schaap started playing one track from the Saturn Interstellar Loways album. That was one of many that Harvey Picard had talked about, and I'd never heard a thing from. And we said, Phil, if you're going to play that, just play the whole record. The entire LP is extremely rare. Nobody knows where to find it. And he actually played the whole record. And I taped it off the air. I still have that somewhere.
Must have been a thrill.
Yeah, because there was this long period of time when there was published work that was available to me. I read Downbeat sometimes, I read Coda a lot and so forth in those days. There was published material about all these things Sun Ra had done, he had put on record, and where could you find it? And this was before I was even terribly familiar with, some of the Philadelphia era Saturns, the ones with the homemade labels and all that. So I also got to see Sun Ra live a number of times when I was in the New York area. The first time I saw him was when I was at the Jean Piaget Society Conference, a developmental psychology conference, which met for many years in Philadelphia. And whenever I was in Philly for that, I would look to see if the orchestra was playing anywhere. This was 1984. They were playing at the Afro-American Museum on Race Street, and had to see that. But I didn't get any other chances to hear the band in Philadelphia. I mean, the ones that I got were in New York City.
And that was in the mid to late 80s?
Yeah, 1986, 87, actually up through 1990. I left New York City for the job at Clemson in 1991. And that, unfortunately, was also the year that Sonny had his first stroke, and he was able to come back and perform with the band a few times after that. But, there was a period of time when the orchestra really wasn't performing much anywhere. And it was when I got to Clemson, got, sort of set up in the psychology department, got some notion of how I was going to teach developmental psych and cognitive and experimental and the other standard courses that they wanted me to teach, that there was a period of time, this says something about academic culture, but also about Clemson, when no one in the department was using email except me. This is 1991, 92, 93. It's impossible to imagine now. The day I walked in the door at IBM, they just said, this is what we do here. And I got very used to using email. And after a while, I was able to do email correspondence with academics and some other people outside the company. So, I just expected that that's what would be happening. No. Students were calling their professors on the landline phone all the time. Various offices at the university were calling professors on the phone. So I got email, but the only way I could get it was through a telephone modem. And this meant the department secretary wasn't always very happy with me, because whenever I had my email connection up, all my calls would get transferred to her desk. And I actually joined a Sun Ra discussion list, I think it was in 93, using email through a telephone modem.
And is that the Saturn list you're referring to?
That was the Saturn list, the first version of it, yeah. I wasn't one of the founders of it, but I don't remember anymore exactly how I heard about it, but I joined it pretty early.
That was a great community.
It really was very cooperative in spirit. There's a review in Dutch of the first edition of the Earthly Recordings that even comments on that. I thought the reviewer had an unusually good sense of, how the work was done. And this was, even though I was going like gangbusters trying to get stuff published and in psychology and so forth, I had been, taking notes in the margin of discographies. I had one of those little black 3-ring binders from Tillman Stahl, with the stuff painted in gold on the front. I've been writing stuff in the margins for years. No, I don't think that's it. How about this date? Whatever. or just, gee, I wish I could get a hold of this thing. That was another common notation. But I just started from there. I took my sort of hand-corrected version of Tilman Stahl, and other people on the list were interested in that, and I started posting pieces of it. Pretty soon somebody said, you ought to write a book about that. And I figured, well, I've already done a lot of the work, so why not? Okay, other things that were relevant, serious CD reissues of Sun Ra were starting to happen then. I can still remember walking into a record store in Athens, Georgia. That's a college town that's about 80 miles by road from Clemson. It's also a much bigger town. So it has more college town things in it, more college town amenities, one of which is a used record store that still exists in 2020. I walked into Walk Street and I figured, okay, maybe they'll have something by Sun Ra I don't know about or haven't seen before. And it was right after Evidence Music had made the deal with Alton Abraham. And there were, the first 5 CDs were there. So I bought all 5 and took them home. A couple of them were, ones that were recordings I was familiar with. The other stuff I'd never heard before, or I hadn't heard except on, Phil Shapp's broadcast. So that was helpful. I wrote to Evidence and said, hey, if I can help you guys with anything, please let me know. And pretty soon, Jerry Gordon at Evidence was asking me to, research the song stacks and the recording credits. I did that for quite a while before I did any liner notes for them.
And was that before or after the publishing of Earthly Volume 1?
I started working with Evidence within a few months of their first issues in 1992.
Okay.
So I was already doing this before I published the book, yeah. Okay. I also, while I was at IBM, would occasionally write a brief review of a concert or a record and send it around to some folks I knew there who were also into jazz. And after I got to Clemson and I figured, hey, I'm in a place where jazz concerts virtually never occur. Once in a while at the university's Performing Arts Center nowadays, it's called the Brooks Center. They'll have one band in there. And, if I'm able to go, I go. But that's about it, okay? Even today, there's not much. So I printed out a bunch of what I thought were my better pieces, put them in an envelope, and mailed them to Bob Roosh at Cadence magazine. I was already familiar with the magazine. I'd been reading it for a while, and said, here's an example of how I write. Do you want me as a reviewer? He said, yes. So I worked for Roosh for off and on for about 7 years. Eventually, I got so busy with other stuff, including the second edition of the Earthly Recordings, that I wasn't as enthusiastic about doing reviews anymore, and it sort of wound down. But that's how it started.
Really appreciate you sharing your story in that perspective, because I think it's very important from where we sit right now as far as Sun Ra scholarship and access to recordings, to remember how far we've come and how important not only the work that you've contributed, but labels like Evidence, other researchers and authors like, as you mentioned, Tilman Stahl and Hart McGeerkin, how much that laid the foundation for where we are now, which in many ways is, other than not being able to see Sun Ra himself perform, is really the golden age of Sun Ra scholarship and access to recordings. I think for younger people or newer fans, they have no idea what it was like in the time that you're describing.
Well, in fact, it would be good to make a shout out to a couple of other people. You mentioned Hartmut. Yeah, I've had the good fortune to talk to Victor Schoenfield, who was a very early, writer about Sun Ra. I found out from him, through him and through Chris Trent about Julian Vane's work, which, sometimes involved directly ordering Sun Ra records from Chicago, like in 1960. That's what it took back then. I started corresponding with Hartmut pretty soon after I got active on the Saturn list. And that's what led to my getting a chapter in that book that he did in 1994, which is now available in a revised edition. And I still have a number of records that Hartmut sent me. That was very helpful to me.
Now, other than Hartmut, you had mentioned Tilman Stahl. The other early discographer of Sun Ra that we should mention is Otto Flukiger.
I actually met him. Otto was a good friend for many years of Armin Büttner. Armin is a guy I met through the Saturn List also, and he still writes for an entertainment weekly in Zurich. And I had the chance in, I think it was 1998, when I was in Switzerland, to go visit Armin, and we went to Otto's chalet, which was packed to the roof with 78s. Pretty amazing guy. I still think, Armin would know much better than I would. I mean, there's still a lot of things that Otto recorded when he was visiting the United States in the summer that, have not been released, but might be worth it.
What recordings are you referring to?
If Otto was in New York for a week or so, he'd find out who was playing at the clubs, and if it was okay, he would go and record it. I'm just coming up with names at random right now, but there's about an hour by C Sharp and his group. Quite good stuff from about 1980 that Otto recorded, and that got a limited circulation release, shall we say, in Switzerland. Yeah. Now, there's a bunch more of that. The reason Armin and I started the Chicago web pages, the Red Saunders Research Foundation with Red Saunders, well, it was because Sonny had done arrangements for him. But the reason we picked Tom Archa, the tenor saxophonist, as the other person we did a page about at first was because Otto had a huge file full of notes about Tom Archa and owned most of Tom Archa's surviving records, and told us we should write about Tom Archa. This is a guy who was good. He's been neglected. You should write about him. So we did.
So in addition to the work that you do for the web pages, not only Sun Ra, but all of the other Chicago musicians, et cetera, that you're referring to, when you're doing your discographical work, other than pulling together source material from previously published discographies and cleaning it up, aligning it, making sense of it, what is your process as far as identifying musicians and songs that aren't listed? Specifically in Earthly Recordings, there are group lineups presented for each of the recordings to the best of your ability, and I'm sure that's based on existing knowledge, but also using the logic of what you know for touring lineups at the time. But there's also a lot of compositions that might be referred to as untitled or unidentified. How do you go about that process of making your best estimations, and with what kind of certainty can you do it?
Okay, well, this is a little bit different from what we've usually done on the Red Saunders web pages. Yeah, what we do on the Chicago website, of course, it does vary a bit with the label or the musician, and it depends on what was previously published about them. Sometimes we're writing about, say, Chess Records, and a lot's been written about Chess Records. Sometimes we're writing about a label that was briefly run by a trumpet player named Melvin Moore called Glowtone, where nobody knows anything. Okay, the records are just out there, and we had to work from the artifacts back to anything else. With Sun Ra, we started with existing discographies, some of which were pretty well worked out, but we tried to supplement that with anything we could learn from talking to musicians. Before the 1994 book came out, and there was some activity like that afterwards, but a lot of it was 93, 94. I tried to talk to as many musicians in the Chicago area who had played with Sonny back then as were still around. Many of them were still around then, fortunately, and were willing to talk to me. And, they would make comments about who was in the band when and whether it was typical to do a certain number in a certain way. Apparently, for instance, Ancient Ethiopia with that solo by Hobart Dotson may have been done that way just once in the studio, okay?
Wow.
This was, the number was in their repertoire. People who were in the band around 1958, 59 all remember it. There were other versions of it, but they never had trumpet solos. That might have been a one-time inspiration that Sonny got, for all we know. Okay, so that helped. Sometimes that meant that what was on the back of an old Saturn LP or whatever was not accurate. No, it was a different drummer from the person they mentioned or whatever. For the more recent orchestras, the orchestras of the 70s, 80s, into the early 90s, I'd seen enough live concerts, and after a while I'd heard lots more recordings of live concerts, and I had a pretty good idea of who the core people were, who was there pretty much every time, not just a one-time or an occasional guest, and what they sounded like. And so a lot of it was done by ear.
For all of the unidentified swing songs, all of the unidentified blues songs, how much of those in your mind might be one-off improvisations or songs that were composed and rehearsed on the road and performed maybe one time, as opposed to covers of classic jazz songs that are just truly still yet to be identified?
Okay, several parts to that. There's what became a generic designation in the earthly recordings, untitled improvisation. And these were the things where, Sonny would come up in front of the band and he would turn and face the band and he would begin sort of conducting them. And, it was pretty clear what was going on there. After seeing this procedure in a live concert a few times, I could pretty much tell from a recording that that's what they were doing. And of course, it was not going to be the same thing on a different night or even in a different set. With the unidentified blues, I don't know how many of those were sort of in the repertoire. That is, Sonny had rehearsed them, he had notated some version of them, and how many of them were really just sort of improvised. Okay, we're going to do a blues now, roughly this tempo, and it would just go from there. Probably a mixture. I don't know for sure.
Okay.
Somebody who has access to more manuscripts may be able to correct me on that. Yeah, let's see. Unidentified swing tunes, mostly these would be older pop or swing numbers that I just couldn't recognize or that people I asked didn't know the titles of. I've listened to enough jazz from different eras and enough related popular music that I have a pretty good memory for standards of different sorts. I don't always catch them, but I catch them most of the time. And, once in a while something slips past. I got a correction on a 1960 live recording in Chicago the other day. It was from Graham Khanna. I don't know if you know him.
I know of him.
Yeah, he's a pianist and band leader who was active in San Francisco for a long time. I think he's in New York now. Yeah. Graham said, by the way, do you realize what that tune is? It's the theme to the TV show Mr. Lucky by Henry Mancini.
Oh, how cool is that?
And apparently there is a legitimate jazz version of it that some people might have heard by Pepper Adams and Donald Byrd, but not on an album of theirs that I've ever listened to. Okay. And I'm sure there are other things like that where somebody is going to know what that tune is. And Chris and I and the other people we consulted did not. But that's where those identifications came from.
Now, in your research, do you hold out any hope that there might be air checks of the pre-Chicago Birmingham era Sonny Blunt Orchestra? Have you ever heard any rumblings on that topic?
Well, I wish there were, but I'd love to be proven wrong. I doubt it. Recording off the radio was not a common procedure back in the, say, the 30s and 40s. Generally, you had to be willing to spend money for cumbersome equipment and acquire at least some skill as an audio engineer to make it work. And we know from all of these fans recording Charlie Parker off the radio in the New York area, quite variable results too. Some of them came out sounding pretty good, and some of them came out sounding awful. But I just don't think that there was much of that happening in Birmingham or other parts of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, where that band used to play. It would be nice to find something. Sonny might have made some acetate or demo type recordings back when he was leading the Sonny Blunt Orchestra. There's been some talk of them, but the likelihood of any of those still being around seems pretty small. We can hold out hope. I mean, if John Steiner could go into a junk shop in Chicago in the early 40s and find a completely unmarked test pressing, which he paid for having no idea whether it was of any interest at all, and he put it on and it was Jelly Roll Morton, it can happen, but it seems fairly improbable.
The Others and Their World. Take one.
Also, in regards to identifying recordings, can you tell me a little bit about how you've gone about identifying all of the dates that Sun Ra did in Chicago, probably, most well known for Red Saunders in an arrangement capacity? You have, along with the Red Saunders Foundation, have identified a lot of recordings that were previously unknown to have a Sun Ra involvement. And I know that with the publishing of Michael Anderson's Eternal Myth box set, where he's included a lot of recordings of that area, that there seem to be some discrepancies about accepting whether Sun Ra was or wasn't involved. But how do you go about that yourself to make those determinations?
Well, anything that fed into the second edition of the Earthly Recordings, that was either my identification of Sonny as the arranger or Chris Trent's. Actually, Chris did a lot of that, or it was Armin Buettner's, okay? And I've actually, with some of these identifications, there's really not much of a chance of missing them, because nobody else in Chicago in 1953, certainly none of the people who would have been known to or around Red Saunders, would have produced an arrangement like the one on Call My Baby by JoJo Adams. That was a record I was interested in because it was made, besides the fact that Red's orchestra was on it, it was made for Parrot Blue Lake. We were doing research on that, but it was not that easy a record to find. And one day I got an MP3 from Armin and he said, "Who do you think arranged this?" And I took one listen to it and I said, "That's Sonny. What is this?" JoJo Adams singing in front of a Red Saunders unit. So some of them just jump out at you. I got the Voodoo Blues, Joe Williams number with Red Saunders that wasn't issued till the CD era. You hear that once and you pretty much know what's going on there. Now there are others that are harder for one of two reasons. Either because Sonny was doing a more conservative arrangement, he certainly knew how to do that if he wanted to, or because his role was not the primary one. There are stories about Red Saunders getting an arrangement from one of his usual sources and then bringing it to Sonny, who would review it and touch it up. Well, how do you know what was, arranged by Johnny Pate or somebody like that, and what was Sonny's addition or change to it? You get into the weeds when you encounter stuff like that. But yeah, there are enough cases of arrangements that were never publicly credited to Sun Ra on the record label or anywhere else that really can't have been done by anybody else, especially if it's, prior to 55, 56. And obviously, people in that community, whatever they thought of Sonny's personal habits or what he talked about and so on, knew that he could do these arrangements. He could do them quickly. He could do them reliably, and there would be something different about him.
Now, other discographers also have the benefit in major cities of having musician union records and recording company session records to rely on. Do you have any of that documentation in these cases?
Most of what I can call on now, and that's, used, say, on the RSRF Sun Ra page, or that's in the chapter I did for one of John Corbett's books. Most of that we got a hold of after we started the Red Saunders Research Foundation. A lot of that didn't really come online, at least for us, until after 2000, after the second edition of the Earthly Recordings. Bob Pruder, who is still living in the Chicago area, worked there for years as an editor and later as a college librarian, knew a lot of people there and got access to pretty much the complete surviving records of Local 208, the Segregated Musicians Union. And there's some pretty amazing stuff in there. I mean, it's kind of hit or miss. It partly depends on who took the notes of the board meeting and so on. But the Local 208 minutes still record the occasion when Buster Bennett, the multi-saxophone player and blues singer, got into a scrape with Preston Jackson, a trombonist from New Orleans, over money that Jackson had loaned him. And they got into a fist fight in the cloakroom. Okay. I mean, that's in the minutes. So there's not much about contracts that Sonny made for appearances by his band. I mean, his name is absent from the contract list sometimes for years on end there. I mean, 1946, he's there once, then he's not there again until 1954. But Sonny himself and some of the people who we know were around him do get referred to. And if you know the sort of little lecture he gave or the little sermonette he gave on one of the A&M CDs, today is examination day, right? Yeah, he actually got elected to the examination board for Local 208. So he had to have a pretty good relationship with a lot of the people who ran that union local and, were regulars at the meetings and such. So we learned something from those. Anytime somebody online has a different edition of the Chicago Defender, like say a weekday edition instead of the so-called national edition that appeared on Saturdays during the 40s and 50s, stuff turns up. Sonny plays a dance put on by some social club. It's in a weekday issue, but not in the national edition. And also, if it was a social club in Chicago, I mean, it doesn't matter if people in Pittsburgh are reading about it. They can't do anything with that information. You see what has recently become available online and see if anything new is there, and sometimes there is. One other thing about sources. This is, in fact, it's the work of many people, but John Corbett has taken a lead role in it, rescuing the Alton Abraham papers, basically, from Alton Abraham's old house and getting them into some semblance of order and getting them to the University of Chicago Special Collections has really meant a lot. Yeah, I've spent maybe 3 or 4 days working on those, and there's much more I could do if I have more time to spend in Chicago. What we know about that marathon session in 1960, and we even are in a position to know now why different people had different memories about it, why somebody said it was a Hall recording company and all this kind of stuff. But Sonny and Alton went to great lengths to sneak around the union, because they really apparently meant for Sonny's current unit to just record all day, as many tracks as they could lay down. But of course, if they had filed a standard union contract, they would have had to pay everybody a bunch of money up front. So what they did was they went to Milwaukee. They didn't use hall recording. They used an Elks Hall in Milwaukee. And they figured that the Milwaukee still had a segregated union too, but it was tiny. They figured that probably nobody from the Milwaukee union was going to pay a whole lot of attention to what they were doing. And they were right. So they ended up writing out contracts as though they were just recording 4 numbers instead of, 25 or 30 or whatever it really was. And I wouldn't have a clue about this, and nobody else would, without going through all this stuff that Alton Abraham, stored away for years, and finding the actual paperwork like, wait a minute, Local 587, which one is that? Okay, Milwaukee, and that kind of thing.
I got them 90 all for the planet, beat us. I got them 90 all for the planet, beat us. Zoom, 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 up in the air, up, zoom, up in the air. I got them 90 all for the planet, beat us.
I'm curious, with all of the discoveries that you've presented through your work of previously unknown songs, sessions, and details, if there's one in particular that stands out in your mind as a major one that just still gives you a thrill when you think of it.
Well, I'll have to think about that one for a minute, because somebody once said I had just described my 500 favorite tenor sax solos by John Milton. And when we're talking about somebody who's as prolific as Sonny was, and not just prolific, but Sonny did all kinds of different things. The first time I heard his first transition session, on a Delmark reissue, I couldn't relate that to what Sonny was doing in the late 60s at all. Okay, like, could these be the same people, any of them? After a while, you start seeing what some of the steps are in between and so forth. But I would speak more incrementally about that. And part of the reason I would do it is that there's stuff in the Sun Ra archives that other people have been working on. I don't know anything about them, okay? There's such a wealth of material there that it is still only partly explored. But I would say finding things like 2 additional tracks in stereo from the session of March 6th, 1959, plus realizing that the first Interstellar Lellways is actually from that session. Things like that are pretty significant.
I continue to be really drawn to the Chicago era and all of the discoveries and information that you've helped to disseminate around all of the recordings and arranger dates, sideman dates that revolved around Club de Lisa.
Speaking of which, there's another catch that it's pretty significant musically, but it was one of these things that was hidden in plain sight for like half a century. And Chris Trent is the one who caught this. There were 2 sets of recordings that Coleman Hawkins made on at least a couple of visits to Chicago for Parrot Blue Lake. Okay, this was during a period when he was having trouble getting a contract with a major label and so forth, and Al Benson talked him into doing some stuff. And some stuff that was done in a regular studio, sometimes with a bit heavier arrangements than I would prefer. But then there were these other numbers that Benson never issued. They eventually were sold to Savoy and put on an LP. And they were, done in an empty club with just a quartet. And, Chris was the one who started listening carefully to those and said, hey, this is Sun Ra recording with Coleman Hawkins. Yeah, well, these are from 1953. and Savoy got a hold of them and released them later. But they were made for Parrot Blue Lake. Probably Al Benson figured that the stuff that was done at the studio sounded better and, didn't do anything with them, but he eventually sold them to Savoy. There is also a 1948 recording of Sonny with Coleman Hawkins. He often talked about doing that. He talked about that one so much that people didn't even realize he might have worked with Hawk on another occasion. Unfortunately, the only version I've heard of it is badly distorted. It's from whatever kind of paper tape recorder or whatever exactly Sonny had in 1948, and it's not been well preserved. But there is a recording of Sonny backing Coleman Hawkins on I Got Rhythm from 1948. Maybe somebody will figure out how to get it into, a decent semblance of sound for release.
Oh, that would be wonderful, because it's something that Sun Ra referred to repeatedly over the years in interviews. So to have auditory evidence of that is major.
Yeah. Now, he was very proud of having worked with Hawk, and yes, there's more of that around than one might have thought. So, but yeah, compared to the way that Armin and Bob Pruder and the other folks who work on the Chicago pages have approached other labels or other artists, what we usually do with labels that are not well documented is try to get actual copies of the records, or at least good quality pictures of the labels, the trail off area, all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot you can learn from the actual artifacts. Sometimes there's nothing else left from that company. Glowtone Records, 2 releases, names of a lot of the musicians on the label, because they were considered to be jazz records. Matrix numbers from United Broadcasting, a known quantity. That was a studio that a lot of people recorded at in Chicago, and there was a certain logic to those numbers. You can use them to figure out roughly what the year was. And one listing for Glowtone that I found in Billboard from 1952, by which time the label was defunct. The recordings were made in 1949, and it had a street address in Chicago, which seemed like, hey, this is a residential neighborhood in the South Side. What's this? I was able to do some further newspaper research and to discover that the address belonged to the home of Melvin Moore's parents.
Wow.
Yeah. That's the kind of stuff you have to work with.
That's detective work.
Yeah, because we're talking about a bunch of little indie labels that didn't keep a lot of files. Even companies that ended up having big names like Chess or VJ or whatever weren't very meticulous about that. And the small ones, all of that might have gotten thrown away. We're so lucky that Alton Abraham's papers didn't get thrown away.
I just shudder to think of that dumpster. Yeah, and it shows there's a lot of work that goes into it, and I thank you for that. from where you stand today in your perspective, what are your thoughts on the authenticity of the Song of the Stargazers album?
I don't know. That one still puzzles me. What I have on it, maybe somebody has something that's better than that, is, an analog tape that somebody made from a copy that appeared to be a stereo record, except that you could only hear one channel most of the time. Okay.
Right.
And beyond that, I mean, there isn't anything on it that says to me, absolutely, this can't be Sonny, but there's nothing on it that particularly says to me it is Sonny either.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not totally up to date on the latest thoughts regarding that particular one. It's been a long time since I listened to that tape copy or anything. And
I think the surviving copy that everyone's still referring to is that cassette that you speak of that circulated and originated from around the Saturn List era. No other copy
That's when I heard it.
surfaced. And the more that I listen to it and really think about it, it seems highly skeptical to me that, number one, it's the orchestra, and number two, that those are all Sun Ra compositions. And at best, perhaps, he might have been guesting with another band. I mean, there's the telltale signs that we would look for as far as Sun Ra's involvement, but additionally, there's the very telltale evidence of the orchestra musicians. And that even seems to be more lacking.
Yeah, Michael Anderson is still trying to dig up all the things that Sonny because they weren't always together, and members of the orchestra were participating in the New York area when it was 1961, 62, 63, and they had very few gigs and no money, and Ed Bland was finding work for them here, or Tom Wilson was finding work for them there. And I figure there's more of that stuff out there. I've recently bid on eBay for an album of Bermudan music, I think you call it, that Michael had mentioned. I want to hear that for myself. There's some like Frankenstein and Dracula albums that were aimed at kids or whatever that Michael thinks Sonny might have been involved with. I have not had a chance to hear those yet. But okay, I mean, Marshall Allen played the Morrow on a Limbo album, so you never know.
Yeah, that Roz Crony album. Do you have any more details about this Frankenstein Dracula album? Because other than Sun Ra, one of my great loves is the black and white horror cinema of the 30s era. So when you say that, a chill just ripped up my spine, because two of my favorite things in one spot.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's almost contemporary with the Monster Mash. And
yes, exactly. Yeah, that was the revival.
One other thing which I know has sonic problems, but it was certainly an important discovery for me, and I still like listening to it. There's a demo that Sonny either made in the back of Jimmy Davis's record shop in Chicago in 1955, or he made somewhere else and delivered it to Jimmy Davis, hoping that Jimmy would use it. It's Sonny on one side solo, and on the other side with some members of the orchestra trying out his brand new Wurlitzer 110 electric piano. And it's got distortion on it because on the solo material, they put the microphone too close to the built-in speaker of the electric piano, and on the other side with more musicians, it's balanced a little better, but it still doesn't sound great. There was a guy I knew who had known Jimmy Davis, a record collector in California, and he said, I still got a bunch of stuff from Jimmy Davis. Some of it doesn't even have any names on the labels. This one didn't. He said, are you interested in any of that, man? And some of what he had gotten from Jimmy Davis was early Von Freeman. Okay.
Wow.
Von and George Freeman. Well, yeah, okay. I'm interested in that. Some of it was gospel. Some really good gospel groups. Nobody has any idea who they were. And he said, there's this one that's got electric piano on it. And I said, can you play me a bit of that over the phone? He did it. I said, I want that one. I want that one for sure. I knew it was Sonny right away.
And this is the entry on your webpage, Sonny Blunt to Sun Ra, that is from Club 51. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
we're calling it Club 51, although Jimmy Davis held on to copies of demos that people made in his store, even when he probably had no interest in releasing them. But yes, it's a demo that was either made in the back of his store or made somewhere else and given to him with the hope of getting a deal for release on Club 51. And if you think about how small a label Club 51 was, that tells you that Sonny and Alton and the folks in the orchestra weren't real sure who else was going to record their stuff, and release it commercially. So yeah, that was a pretty big one, even though the sound is not the world's greatest.
I know that myself and all of the Sun Ra community hangs on the scholarship that you and Christopher Trent have done with the Earthly Recordings. And the one question whenever we refer to Earthly Recordings is there ever going to be an edition 3?
Well, I'm willing to accept proposals on the subject. Okay, I'm retired from teaching psychology. I have some interests as far as psychology and publishing things, but I don't need to do them professionally or anything. I have nothing to prove there, I think I have the time to put into something like this, but realistically, I do need more collaborators. The second edition was more than 3 times as long as the first one. And new edition is going to add quite a few entries that were not present in the second one. I don't even have a good estimate of how many more. The other thing is it really needs to be primarily electronic publication. That's the way all these things are going now. I'm fortunate to be at a point in my life where I don't have to worry too much about money. So if it doesn't sell a bunch of copies, that doesn't matter. But that's really how it needs to be done. It needs to be electronic. By the way, when I did the indexes for the first Earthly Recordings, you may not believe this, but the indexes are not from a database.
Oh, wow.
They're just
all manually inputted?
Just a flat text file. That's all they are. And Chris Trent, who is a lot more savvy about databases than I am, he was in the computer world for quite a few years, more than I was. He asked me, do you want to try to use a database for the second edition? And I said, well, how much time are we going to spend taking everything that's in the flat file and transferring it into a database? And then how much time are we going to spend getting back out of the database, what we need for the index? And he said, you've got a point. So we just expanded the flat file, but you can't do that forever. It was getting close to unmanageable with the second edition.
Right. And do you have any sense of the third edition as far as the increase in scope? What that would mean if we were going by old school printed page count? I would imagine.
Well, we went from 250 to 850.
Right.
And you really do need all the indexes and the back matter for something like this, or it's not going to do for the user what the user needs, So we want to keep all that. I don't know how many rehearsal tapes from the house in Philadelphia are extant that have not been issued even in a limited edition. Probably piles of them, okay?
Right.
With Chicago, that it's going to be harder to find new stuff, but from the Philadelphia era, it could end up not only being over 1,000 pages, but depending on how much is there, it could end up being double the length that the second edition came out to.
Yeah, that's my gut right there.
That's
depending on where
argument.
You limit the scope. Because the Creative Audio Archives, if you add that into the scope of it, then you're more than double.
Yeah, I mean, there's some degree of overlap in there, and sometimes I know where the overlap is, and sometimes I merely suspect it. I would need to look more closely at it to be sure. But yeah, okay, it could end up double the length, and that's a really strong argument for electronic publication.
Yeah, that's a really big book. And do you have an ongoing relationship with Cadence as a publisher, or would you be looking for a new publishing partner?
Well, I would need to find out whether Cadence is publishing anything anymore. As far as I can tell, there are bits and pieces of the Cadence North Country operation still there, but not much. We were kind of straining the capabilities of Cadence Jazz Books with the second edition.
Yeah, it's a monumental piece of publishing and printing.
I mean, I heard some complaints from Bob Roosh about it, although, he didn't tell us to cut anything, but it was probably about as much as they could handle at the time. And there was one page that got messed up. There was a fold in it before they reproduced it, and they had to insert a replacement page. I hope there's one in your copy.
So if you were to do an edition 3 in Earthly Recordings, the second edition, it was put out at a time where the John Gilmore-led orchestra was working. This is before the Marshall Allen-led Sun Ra Orchestra. So if you were to do an edition 3, do you have any ideas whether you would limit the discography to Sun Ra's recorded output, or whether it would be inclusive of all of the orchestra work that's happened since then?
Okay, well, that's a fair question. One thing I was completely wrong about, I don't know what other people thought, say 1990 when it was clear that Sonny had some health problems, 1991 after he had his stroke and so forth. Back then, if somebody had said to me, do you think anybody is going to continue this band after Sonny leaves the planet, I would have said, how could anybody do that, right?
Of course.
Well, I mean, if John hadn't had his own health problems, I think he actually would have been a pretty effective leader. But look at Marshall, and he's still going.
It's incredible.
I don't know if you're familiar with an album that Armin Buettner recorded in Switzerland with just Marshall and Cash Killian.
I am, yeah.
Oh,
it's a wonderful recording.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Amazing. Marshall seems to be gaining power as time goes by.
Yeah, I mean, for a guy who plays mainly wind instruments, to be able to play his instrument, let alone lead a band at such an advanced age, it's just unheard of. He's not a conductor, he's not a pianist, okay? He has to keep his own instrument in tune, and he's still doing it. So, yes, I would try to accommodate latter-day orchestral recordings as long as the orchestra is led by John or Marshall. That's another reason why I need collaborators.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you're putting out the call for collaborators, I'm sure that there are several individuals that are doing hard work on their own that would jump at the call to action. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
They can reach me at my university email address, which still works, campber@clemson.edu.
Excellent. Robert, thank you again for the work that you've done. I can't really express how much it's meant to me and how many hours over the last 25 years I've spent with your and Christopher Trent's book, and the chance to get to talk to you about it is truly an honor.
What is particularly good about the book, whatever its strengths or weaknesses now, is that a large percentage, not everything, but a large percentage of what's covered in the book is something that you can actually hear if you want to. Okay.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, back when Julian Vane and Victor Schoenfield and all those and Otto were working, and when Harvey Picard was writing, you couldn't do that. It was very frustrating.
Also, with all of the additional discoveries that have happened since the publishing of the book, it's largely still very, very accurate and serves as a pillar in the foundation for all of the fans that have come since then, which I'm sure is probably a gratifying feeling too.
Well, it's good to know that. Like I said, as soon as a discography gets out the door, people are going to find mistakes in it, and they have. But at least it's something that can be built on. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
Excerpts of the music of Sun Ra are used with permission of Sun Ra LLC. Copyright 2020, Sun Ra Archive with a K.